All right, welcome everyone. We'll give it some time to let folks get logged in, but we see the numbers coming in right now, so hang on in there.
Are you around after this? Are you here today? You want me to start for you there?
No, it's okay. I'm on this thing. A fire would be tight though. I think we're gonna start a fire. It's pretty chilly here.
There you go. Okay, we'll give it about 2 more minutes and get started. All righty, I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone. My name is Dan Waldvogel, the membership coordinator with the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union. Welcome to the Colorado Grain Chains Homeschool webinar series. This is number 17. This is dessert, moving beyond just wheat flour. So it'll be an exciting topic and something new that we haven't really hit on a whole lot yet. So thank you for joining us. As many of you have heard me say before, as we go along, use the Q&A function to ask questions. That's going to be the best way to do that. And then there is the chat function as well, but I will redirect you as much as possible to the Q&A because that's the best way to manage questions and make sure we can get to everyone. If we don't get everything answered in this hour, we'll try our best to get your questions answered offline. Another common question that comes in is this recording going to be available? Yes, it is. It's going to be on posted to YouTube, hopefully, within a few days after today. And then also the recipe will be posted on YouTube in the description. So we're going to make it as easy as possible for folks to be able to access that. But there's always other goodies for Colorado Grain Chain members to be able to access when it comes to this type of information. So you can learn more at coloradograinchain.com. I think that's all the front loading stuff I need to do. So we'll get right to our speaker. We're really fortunate today to have Katie Gourley joining us. Excited to hear more about everything that you're doing, Katie. Katie is a self-professed baker, writer, creative practitioner, and grain nerd, hailing from Portland, Oregon. And she has a long track record in the food and ag world. And Katie, I'll let you tell the audience more about yourself. But thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you for being here today with us, Katie. I'll pass it over to you.
Cool. Hi, thank you everyone. My name is Katie. I'm coming to you all from the house that I live in and bake out of, located on the unceded ancestral lands of the Multnomah, Klamath, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes here along the Columbia River, what is often referred to as Portland, Oregon. Yeah, today I'm going to be talking through baking a recipe for whole grain spelt and olive oil cake. It's one of my most frequently used recipes because you'll see as we walk through it, it's basically a choose your own adventure cake. It's kind of like a Mad Libs. So it's also a super accessible entry point for baking with 100% spelt. And for me, I really like this cake because it's a reminder that baking is an act of creativity and an expression of your personal identity and character, and can be this platform to explore yourself and also the realities of the seasons and our dependability on the rhythms of the earth. This cake can also be tailored to whatever you need. It can be like super no fuss, super rustic, like a Tuesday morning breakfast slice with coffee. It can be fruited up, it can be spiced up. It can be totally zhuzhed for a wedding cake with any sort of decoration. So I'll walk you through all those variations. Yeah, and just a little roadmap. I'm gonna start, I realized I forgot to start sharing my screen because I have some slides to show y'all. Okay. Great. So just a little roadmap of where I'm going today. I'm going to talk just really quickly about who I am, how I found myself in the whole grain movement, but that's kind of the boring part. So I'll mostly get into talking about spelt and its identities and characteristics as a grain, and then spend a bunch of time talking about cake, because that's probably why you signed up for this webinar. Sweet. So first, just to start off, I know some people are really good at this, but the whole concept of presenting to a room full of people who are not together, who aren't experiencing the same like atmosphere and temperature and noises and feelings is still a little new and weird for me. So I just wanted to ask if we could take a quick moment to do some grounding together, just to create a bit of togetherness. If you wouldn't mind, I just invite you to take 3 deep breaths. And maybe while you're breathing in, ask what's going on in the ecosystem that you inhabit. What is taking place on the earth that you ground yourself on? 2020 has thrown a lot at us, and so maybe think about what's going on in the natural world around you. So. All right, thank you. Great. Finally, just wanted to give a shout out to the time of season that we're in. It's that time of year that we're taking stock of the harvest. It's Scorpio season, so a season of a lot of profound transition and change and some intensity around feelings about death, and that time where the veil between the living and the otherworldly is a little bit thinner. So before we get into talking about spelt, I just wanted to invite us all to set a bit of an intention or reflect on who it is you bake for. So sorry, I have notes because I'm a nerd. But other than the mouths that you're feeding yourself, is there an idea or a concept or a spirit or an ancestor or a plant that you want to dedicate some of the nourishment that you are manifesting in your bakes with? I come to the world of grains from a perspective of seeds. And I always like to start off from a reminder that grains are in fact seeds, and seeds are cycles of life and death, and they're vessels to hold on to just the absolute mind-blowing wisdom of the more than human world. And they're also the foundation for all of our life, for our biodiversity, for our climate adaptability, for ancestral and cultural knowledge. And so, yeah, I just want to remind us all that those seeds can be these profound vessels of hope and inspiration. but also just want to create space here to acknowledge the truth that seeds can also be a profound vessel for holding on to pain and trauma. So when we're sitting here as bakers or farmers or millers or just like folk who sign up for random webinars about cake, that I'd like to remind us to root ourselves in those systems of trauma and pain that are contained in this work. And that's a topic for a whole separate webinar, but just wanted to make space for that, and also to remind you all that if you haven't, please vote this week. So thank you for that long introduction, and I'll just dive a little into myself and my background baking. As Dan mentioned, I'm a lifelong Portlander. I'm a baker and a writer and aspiring farmer. And I sort of feel like I baked my way into the whole grain movement from two different directions. I studied in graduate school, I studied urban planning, where I focused on food systems planning and movements for food sovereignty. And I wrote a thesis about community seed saving and alternative sharing economies as kind of a care-based solution to some of the extractive and oppressive nature of our industrial food system. So then that was one side of it. And then the other side is a lifelong journey as a personal home baker, as the daughter of a pastry chef, grown up at her elbows, and also some professional experiences baking in both Chicago and Portland. About a year and a half ago, I got out of grad school and kind of found myself diving really deep into alternative grain agriculture and baking as this way to try and translate my interest in biodiversity conservation, food systems, and cultural traditions and ecological knowledge into something material. Like I really wanted something to contribute tangibly to the physical world. So I found myself returning back to some roots in baking. I did an artist residency here in Oregon at the coast, where I literally lived in a tiny cabin in the woods alone, and baked like 8 to 10 loaves of sourdough whole grain boules out of my cabin and like sold them under the table to neighbors. And that eventually kind of evolved into some pop-up pastry events. And that's really how I got involved in getting to know what my baker friend here in Portland calls the grainbow, Annie. It's a great term. Yeah, so that all resulted in a zine that I wrote about grain and grain economies called Baking for Biodiversity. It's a little plug for some zines. If you want any of them, you can get in touch with me. Yeah, and currently I'm a sourdough bread baker. I bake here out of my house with my housemate's wonderful business he started called Starter Bread. Really encourage you to follow his work. And we are a community supported bread business that we use all regional whole grains and long fermentation processes. And it's a subscription based kind of CSA style bread. I personally bake for 3 farm partnerships that we have who do weekly veggie CSAs. And then we nestle a loaf of sourdough bread in their box to kind of round out their holistic weekly food. Yeah. I also kind of awkwardly describe myself as a freelance cake baker. So I do custom cakes that range from birthdays or weddings or just like a Tuesday. So if you're in Portland or know anyone in Portland and want a cake, you can always reach out to me. So yeah, that is enough about me. Let's get into Spelts. And just a reminder, like nothing I'm saying is precious. So if you have information about Spelts or sweet stories or a connection to this grain, like feel free to somehow interrupt me and chime in. Yeah, so spelt is an ancient precursor to wheat. It's one of the earliest domesticated grains in the world. I have found like quite a wide range of years for when it was first cultivated, ranging from 6,000 to 9,000 years ago. But basically, when we say that spelt is an ancient grain, we're referring to the fact that the spelt grains we eat today have remained unchanged since then. Spelt is a member of the farro family, and was originally cultivated in what is now Iran in the Fertile Crescent. And it was introduced to the US in the 1890s via Ohio, where I believe the majority of spelt cultivation is still concentrated, but that might not be entirely correct. And yeah, so spelt is grown agriculturally very similarly to wheat, so it does really well in fertile soils. However, it doesn't thresh as cleanly as wheat because of a thick hull that is maybe kind of why it fell to the wayside in the rise of industrial grain processing and agricultural systems that were looking more towards efficiency. Probably one of my favorite spelt fact discoveries that I have my roommate to thank for is that Hildegard von Bingen, a 12th century German nun, claimed that eating whole spelt would bring about emotional balance due to its intense nutritional qualities. She was said to eat spelt multiple times a day. Found this hilarious Daily Mail headline referring to said fact. Yeah, and so spelt is kind of widely lauded as a super nutritional grain, has a much lower gluten content, and in fact, an entirely different molecular makeup than gluten in modern wheat. So it's been shown to be more easily digested by some folk who have gluten insensitivities. That being said, it is not a gluten-free food. It's fully still has gluten, so not good for someone with celiac or other serious allergies. But it's also intensely high in protein and has a really high level of water solubility, meaning that some of the nutrients in there are super bioavailable. And I put this little note in this slide that because of that water solubility, this might change how much liquid you need if you're using spelt as a replacement for another kind of flour in a recipe. Yeah, so let's get into some of the characteristics of baking with spelt. I always like to say that spelt is like a super low-hanging fruit for anyone who wants to switch to whole grain baking from all-purpose. It's insanely versatile and easy to work with. I find it really easy to replace it in one-to-one ratios and recipes. And it's also just super tasty. It's a soft and kind of airy and tender grain. And if you can't tell, I'm like a super spelt fangirl. It's really good as a whole grain in salads or risottos, soups. It's soup season. I mean, it's always soup season, but right now particularly. And in baking bread, spelt does some crazy wild things. It's like a silly putty-like extensibility. I have a baker friend here in Oregon who bakes an 100% spelt loaf at 100% hydration, and he refers to it as you basically don't look at it, you don't touch it, you mix it, you don't make eye contact with the dough, and you just throw it in a Pullman loaf and let it ferment, and it bakes into this rich and custardy loaf that I think is really phenomenal. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about baking spelt in a cake, but I wanted to give a side shout out to that it is my absolute favorite flour to use in things like pie doughs or galette crusts. It's super tender and flaky. You can use it at 100% in a pie dough or mix it with some other friends from the Greenbow. And if you ever want to talk about sourdough galette dough, please just get in touch with me. It's my favorite recipe. So the cake that we are here to talk about, this is the kind of basic recipe. And it sounds like when this is posted online, the recipe will be in the notes, but if you want to take a screenshot, I also can follow up. I use this in weight measurements more often, and I just want to double check that I got all the conversions right. But it's a super flexible and adaptable cake. It can be made dairy-free, extremely easy, and it's, as you'll see, embarrassingly easy to mix up. So I just wanted to kind of walk through how adaptable it is to different applications by showing some examples of the kind of articulations that this cake has taken in my world. So one of my favorite ways to do this cake is as an upside down cake with seasonal fruits. I'm a big urban forager, so most of these pictured cakes are things that have been found around town or gifted by friends. You can also just plop the fruit right on in there before baking. Sometimes it'll sink, sometimes it won't. That's okay. And just a side note, as you see in this middle cake, I am really stubborn and I keep trying to make this cake into a loaf cake. And it just kind of bakes funny when you put it in a loaf pan. It doesn't want to bake all the way in the middle. And by the time it does, it's formed kind of a thicker crust around the edges, which I actually personally kind of like if you're making it as kind of a snacking cake, kind of a no fuss cake, but just be forewarned if you try and stick this at these measurements in a loaf pan, it's kind of funky. I also love to go with herbal or spiced cake, especially given the nature of the olive oil being kind of rich and robust and earthy. I think it lends itself really well to adding things like rosemary or thyme. This cake kind of is a mashup of a few different olive oil cake recipes, but one of the origin stories is from Kim Boyce's book, Good to the Grain. And hers is a rosemary and chocolate version of a spelt cake. So just like lends itself really well to those earthy flavors. And if I'm using kind of a more savory herb, I tend to kind of boost up the salt just to kind of complement those flavors really well. And it can also be made pretty fancy. So depending on using different fruits, different compotes, different goops, as I like to call them, and frosting, this cake can really be done up if you want it to be. It's definitely the cake that I recommend most often when I get custom cake orders because it can be adapted to like any personal preferences or styles or tastes. And I would say my biggest recommendation when thinking about what to do with this recipe, and probably my biggest recommendation for baking in general, is go for a walk. I always like to go for a walk before deciding what to bake or what to put into something, as a way to just really ground myself in place and in time, and into the rhythms and realities of the natural world. Because when we stop doing that, I think it can be really easy to flip through a recipe book or go online and see a recipe for, a strawberry cake in December. Like the reality is like, yeah, you can probably go to a supermarket and get a clearance shelf full of strawberries and bake that cake, because those are the realities of global capitalism and industrial agriculture. But there's nothing, I don't want to like dismiss that as something that if you want to do, that's okay sometimes too. But I just want to encourage us all to use this cake as kind of a chance to explore a more authentic relationship to time. So that was me talking at you all for a while. I hope that made any amount of sense. But I also just want to quick show you how to make this cake in real time, just so you see how extremely easy it is. I don't have a TV Magic pre-baked final cake, but hopefully the pictures from the slides kind of helped show you what the final product can look like. So I'm going to make up this cake. I kind of pre-measure. I'm going to do like a camera angle change right there. So I weighed everything out so you didn't have to watch me awkwardly do that. But this cake is going to later be turned into a birthday cake for a stranger on the internet that I'm going to go deliver across town later. And it's going to get topped with some cardamom roasted plums and a simple buttercream. So I'm going to keep the actual cake itself super simple in flavor. But as you saw in the recipe, it is truly as simple as just mix wets, put them into dries. So this is a bowl that
I'm going to interrupt you real quick and just make sure, is it okay if I end your screen sharing?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
That
And as I'm doing that, we did have one question come in. I might as well ask you, and then we'll get right into the baking. But Richard was asking, why do you prefer spelt over something like Kamut or Emmer or einkorn?
Oh, that's a great question. I wouldn't say over. To be honest, I do not have a familiarity with Kamut in particular. I love also baking with einkorn and Emmer. I think they do have definitely really different flavor profiles and super different textures. So I find baking with einkorn and Emmer, they're super thirsty and definitely have more of a like whole grain profile, whereas spelt I've found really easy to just it begs itself to be a pastry. That's not a super scientific answer, but I definitely have found, replacing einkorn in cakes. I haven't done Emmer in cakes a lot. I did an Emmer challah last week that actually turned out really great. I did it at about 20%, which was really, really delightful, but you can definitely really like feel the grain a little more than I find in spelt. So if I was doing this cake with einkorn, I would probably cut it 50-50 with pastry, like a whole grain pastry flour. Yeah, but it's not over those. I also love einkorn and Emmer. Yeah, so if you can see all of this, I pre-measured out all the dry ingredients and just sifted them into a bowl. This is spelt flour, whole grain spelt. I'm using spelt from Camas Country Mill here in Oregon, located just kind of outside of Eugene. And this has some just organic cane sugar, salt, and baking powder. And I sifted it all in and then just kind of whisked it together. And then we've got our wet ingredients, which we're gonna pour together. So I've got 3 eggs. And I'm just gonna do that. And I've got some olive oil. I like to use kind of a like richer, heartier olive oil. That's not the right word. But you can also like use a more neutral tasting one, or you could use half vegetable oil, whatever your taste preference is. So I'm gonna pour that in. And I'm gonna pour milk. Give it a good whisk. And at this stage, I just like to make sure this part is really well incorporated. All right, and we're like halfway to Cake Town. I'm gonna grab a spatula that I did not grab before. And then hopefully you can see still. Make it just a little more. And then I kind of create like a little well in my dry ingredients just to make it easier to fold in. And then pour this right on in. All right, I'm not over that. And then as you can see, I'm just gonna start to fold it. Fold it right on in. It's kind of a thicker texture of a batter. Let's get it all mixed in. I'm trying to make sure you can see it while I do that. It'll start off a little lumpy and just keep folding it in until all the dries are mixed in. And sometimes there wants to be like little pockets of flour down at the bottom. And that's okay, but you don't want them to stay there. All right, and that's really it. Oh, there was a little pocket down there. right, and then as you can see, just giving the final little mix in. And like I said, it's kind of a thicker batter. It's not gonna like run. And I'm just gonna pour it straight into cake pan. I lined this with just a little brush of olive oil and then a piece of parchment because this is going out as a birthday cake for someone. If it was for myself, I don't usually use parchment just to kind of conserve on resources. Totally your preference. Everyone has kind of their like secret cake pan prep methods. So I trust in your intuition. And then we're just gonna pour it on in. And I always like to follow the rule if you're baking a cake, not to fill the pan more than 2/3 of the way up for some obvious spillage reasons. There we go. And then just take your spatula, kind of smooth it out. And you can see one of the things I think I put on those notes about baking with spelt is that it's got this like really beautiful copper color. And you can kind of see that in this batter. Yeah, and this is a moment that if you wanted to gussy this cake up with fruit, sometimes I'll just pull something straight out of the freezer. We've got plums preserved from the summer, or apricots, or anything like that. You can pop them on top. If you're gonna make this into an upside down cake, one way to do that is to fill the bottom of the pan with a mixture of kind of equal parts brown sugar and butter, and then arrange the fruit right on in that, and then pour the batter on top of that and stick it in the oven. That, I will give a fair warning, is gonna like create a lot more, gonna need a lot more space. So I would use a deeper pan because sometimes the fruit will kind of bubble up and over and your cake will kind of, I've had some wonky tops of the cake if I don't give it enough space to grow, and then it'll like grow and then sink. Yeah, so then I'm gonna bake this at 350 for honestly the amount of time that it takes to bake. I'm not great at setting timers, so I usually just check in 15-minute intervals for the first 30 minutes, and then 5 minutes after that, just until it's super set and you can put a knife in the middle and pull it out clean. Yeah, that's really all I've got for y'all today. Would love any questions or any cute stories you have about spelt. Or I was gonna put some, this is just some vanilla beans soaked in bourbon. I was gonna put some of that in and then I forgot. So I'll do that in the frosting. Yeah, that's it.
Oh, that's great. No, thank you so much, Katie. We got one question in right now. Oh, I see a couple others coming in too. Actually, we'll go to Suzanne's first because it's more right about the cake, but it says, how dense or fine is the crumb on this cake?
Oh, that's a good question. Because it's an olive oil cake, it's on the denser side. Super moist. Yeah.
Great. And then Mark was asking, he said, I see you have a mill behind you. How often do you freshly grind your flour, and do you like to sift it after grinding?
Oh, that's a great question. So this mill gets used a lot for starter bread, particularly in kind of using different grains at different stages of their expression. Weird way to say that. So we'll use a bread, lots of weeks subscription bread, for example. It was a barley and oat bread, so it had not only barley flour that was freshly milled, but then also cracked barley grain. So it allows us to have varying coarseness. If I'm gonna freshly mill something for pastry, I definitely would sift it because it can just get really all the particulates, if we're not able to grind it super finely, can be a little a little heavy and a little gritty. Yeah, sometimes I've seen people get really creative by like soaking some of those sifted off particles in some milk or citrus juice or just water, and then adding it back into a recipe, just because those things are going to be like the thirstiest part.
Great, thank you. Let's see, while we're still on the topic of the cake, oh, actually, there's a follow-up to that last one from Suzanne. When you say equal parts butter and brown sugar for an upside down, approximately how much would you use for a cake pan that size? I understand it would be a deeper pan.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think half a pound butter, and I think I would do about 2 cups of brown sugar. And that is completely me making up measurements that I usually just do by eye. But I could like follow up with a more scientific response to that. Yeah.
Great. No,
very bad at measuring. I'm a horrible professional baker.
Well, so much of this is experimentation and see what works for you in your kitchen and your appetite and everything. So
yeah, absolutely. I think Kim was saying like a lot of times the answer to these questions are like do it a couple times, see what tastes good, what doesn't. I tend to like things very much on the less sweet side, and that requires some experimentation because sugar obviously does more than just contribute sweetness in a cake. It also has a lot to do with moisture content. So I have definitely baked myself into a corner by trying to like take too much sugar out of certain recipes. And there's ways to compensate that, like round up if you've got 3/4 of a cup of buttermilk or something, boost it up maybe to a cup. If you're going to take out a significant amount of sugar, compensate with a little extra salt because that's also something that has to do with moisture content and flavor. So I just think I invite you to explore what feels good and tastes good and looks good. Sometimes I think people get scared of using their intuition when baking because it's like, baking is such a science. But if it looks right, like it's probably gonna be fine. And if you put something in the oven, it's probably gonna be delicious because you made it.
Great. No, thank you. And I'm gonna ask you 2 questions in one, so you can kind of answer both as you go along, but they're both regarding alterations when it comes to different size cake pans. So the first one is any suggestions for changes you've had success with to adapt this recipe to the loaf tin, like you were mentioning. And then the other one is, have you made small, like 5 or 6 inch cakes with this recipe? Lori's interested in like farmer's market type product.
Yeah, absolutely. I think more often than not, rather than altering the recipe, I think I tend to take some out and put it in a different. I have these little guys that I like to call my tester pans, and these are perfect for if you've got a little too much batter. I think that's where I get myself into trouble is I try to load this whole thing into a loaf pan when really I just need to take a big scoop of it out. And putting it in something like this, baking it off. And then you've got a sweet extra little thing to give to your roommate or your friend or your neighbor or yourself, because we often sometimes we bake a lot of things and then don't get to eat them ourselves. And I do this a lot in a 6-inch pan. I find that I'll bake 2 6 inches out of this one recipe. That's what I use very, very often for like birthday cakes, because I'll do a filled cake with a layer cake, some like fruit goo, frosting, cake, fruit goo and frosting. And I think this is a super great size to just adapt into a 6-inch pan. It's a little bit thinner. If you're doing 2 6 inches out of this, but I think that's nice if you're stacking it.
And then one other question was around muffin tins, and you kind of mentioned that, but do you have any other advice if you're going kind of as small as muffins?
Yeah, this is great as a muffin. I think I took it out, but I had a picture. We did this as a upside down cake with peaches in a little muffin tin, and just kind of dusted it with a little powdered sugar, and it was a super nice sweet treat for the morning. And I could not give you an exact number of muffins you'd get out of this exact recipe, but I want to say it would fit pretty well into 6 as kind of fat muffins. And then if you have those like little tiny muffin tins, probably it would get you about 10 or 12.
Oh, great. And then Victoria was mentioning, I see you often use buttercream for frosting. Do you have a recommendation for something dairy-free for this cake?
Yeah, I think that one of the pictures in the slideshow was a lemon curd that I had made. You can make lemon curd more traditionally with butter, but I've made it as a kind of dairy-free alternative a couple times. I love like a fruit preserve on this cake. Any sort of jam or compote. Like I said, this one's going to have roasted plums that I made from some neighborhood plums that we foraged and then roasted off with just some cardamom and a tiny bit of brown sugar. And I froze a big jar of those, which I'm like thanking past self for. I think right now this cake would be super, super good with ginger baked into it and then like a big schlop of apple butter. It's like really that season for warming spices and things like that. So I think fruit-based things go really well with this cake.
Great, thank you. And and then one other question, just if you have any more to say about, can you talk more about what you said about spelt, changing the liquids in your recipe? So how that works maybe with hydration when it comes to spelt.
Yeah, so spelt is kind of an interesting one because unlike the kind of typical narrative around increasing your percentage of whole grain requiring more liquid and more liquid always, spelt is way more water soluble than whole wheat. So I would say that if you're going from a recipe made for using just all-purpose flour, spelt's still going to be thirstier than that. But if you're working from a recipe specifically tailored for using whole grain or whole wheat in specific, spelt might not want as much moisture. And that is probably a level of science that I don't fully understand and might not be explaining right. So if anyone wants to chime in on that too, I welcome your contributions. But yeah, that's kind of another one of those areas that you kind of want to explore and see like, oh, this recipe, like I replaced 1 for 1 with spelt and it just like didn't need that much liquid. Yeah.
Great. No, thank you. And yeah, Suzanne was mentioning too, just she said that she made pasta the other night with spelt and had a hard time getting the consistency right when she used her standard wheat flour recipe. So maybe she can take some of those tips from you. And then also Marilyn was saying that she still uses white flours as a crutch, thinking that it helps with the structure of whole grain baked products. Do you have any other suggestions to move away from 100% whole grain baking with more confidence? Move away to, I should say, 100% whole grain baking with more confidence. And also, she just said that she recently moved from Colorado to Oregon, so she's really enjoying your webinar today.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, welcome to Oregon. I would say one of the pieces of advice that comes along with baking with 100% whole grains is like we have to alter our expectations a little bit about what a final product looks like. And that's like thought of as a sacrifice sometimes, but I actually think it would be really cool if we reframed it as this exciting new way of looking at food. Because a cake made with 100% whole grain just isn't, it's not going to look like cake made with white flour. And I think that we get stuck thinking like, how can I replicate this as close as possible? But if we pivot our mindset to think about like, how can I make this beautiful 100% whole grain cake, let it express itself as its own unique identity, the world gets a little bit more fun to play around with. It's not going to be the same, but it's going to be, I think, more delicious and unique and special. That being said, if you have this recipe that you just have a taste memory for and you just love it and you want it to feel like that in your mouth, start at 50%. If you're trying to move towards something like spelt in a cake recipe, I think a way to kind of round out some of that more white flour taste is to use a pastry flour. There are whole grain versions of pastry flour. I also use a club pastry flour from Kamut's Country Mill here in Oregon. So if you're looking for a local source, that's a great option. Or things like sifted flours. So Kamut's also has a whole series of sifted wheat. And that's basically, a series of sieves have been used to remove a lot of the heavier particles. So you're still getting a flour that has like all of the nutrients and oils and things from being stone ground whole. But a lot of those like larger pieces have been removed. So it's going to perform a little bit more like an all-purpose flour. My friend Adrienne here, who has taught me a lot about baking with whole grains, she kind of calls the sifted flour series like the best of both worlds. So you're getting a lot of the nutrient profiles of a whole grain flour, but it's going to perform a little bit more like an AP.
Oh, great. And yeah, that kind of goes into Judith's question. She was just mentioning that, she's interested in the integration of design degree and the intersection of food systems in Oregon, and was just curious, especially since you were mentioning, local flour. Are you running out of local flours as the pandemic has continued, or are you having any challenges with accessing products, or how's that supply chain for you?
No, yeah, I think that was like a really interesting question that I feel like everyone was in a bit of a frenzy about in like April. Like, oh my God, we're gonna run out of grain. And the reality was that actually like that supply chain was super, it pivoted entirely, but it wasn't interrupted. I think what we heard from a lot of our local grain growers and millers and distributors was less that they were going to run out of it, but more that they were distributing entirely different quantities. So we saw this like massive shutdown of the food industry at the same time as this huge spike in home baking. And so you saw orders for people who are getting like just massive pallets of 50-pound bags of flours like fall off, and then people who wanted like 4 to 8 pounds of flour at a time skyrocket. So like the quantities at which grain was being and is still being distributed shifted, but I don't think that like, I think it kind of like helped balance the equilibrium almost. It definitely required a huge amount of work and labor and infrastructure change and just like insane hours that folk growing and milling grains have been putting in. So if you know millers or grain growers, like reach out and make sure to be thanking them and asking how they're doing and seeing if there's any way you can support them.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And I know here in Colorado too, Andy carries Spelt at Moxie for sale too, if folks are looking to access it here. I'm sure there's some other options too. That mostly comes from Tyler Wilbanks down in the southwest part of the state. But he does a lot of things with Spelt too. He has different revenue streams. He uses the thick hulls and creates value by making animal bedding, and he has a market for his straw, and he uses draft horses for a lot of the production. So a lot of cool things you can do with that grain. And that kind of brings me into the going back to talking about your idea of the grain bow, which I just love. Richard,
to Annie at Sea Star Bakery here in Portland.
Sure. Oh, you're so gracious too, to make sure that folks get their credit. Richard kind of had 2 questions. he mentioned that most people he knows don't really know about spelt. So how well does your audience receive this kind of new idea of this grain? And then do you find yourself selling the spelt story? And then he had a follow-up question too. Have you tried growing it?
Mm. I think people can get down with spelt. I think there's this really interesting movement in time when we look at spelt was kind of like an early introduction back into the commercial market, thanks to a lot of work in like Germany and the lower Alps, I believe. Like that was kind of a return to like a health movement when you saw a lot more spelt breads on the market, and that influenced a lot of whole grain baking in the U.S. But I think that its first movement was as this kind of like crunchy granola, like hippie food, which I think gave it some interesting taboo and stigma that I'm like very here for trying to pivot and change. But I do think that there was a little bit more like household literacy about spelt than some of the other things like einkorn or emmer or wheat or just like different cultivars of wheat. I think spelt has some recognizability because of that. I always like to tell the story of any grain I'm working with. I think each one has an identity that deserves to come through. But yeah, I think people get excited when you're excited about a new grain. And my wonderful housemate did grow some spelt last year as like a pretty symbolic strip in the front of some of our garden beds, kind of in between our garden and the roadway. And we harvested it. It's really, really beautiful. We harvested like a pretty handful sized amount of grain and symbolically put it into a salad. So it was not an agricultural quantity, but more of a symbolic row cover.
Oh, that's great. Oh, thank you. And Marilyn was also sending out just a kudos, appreciating your mindset approach, and also just grateful for your thoughtful suggestions and info, and especially without white flour shaming. So thank you for that. And an early question that came in that I definitely don't want to miss here too is Marianne was asking, what are your book titles? And then also how can folks access your zines and other products and learn more about you and stay in touch moving forward?
Yeah. So book titles in terms of me, myself, or recommendations?
The question is, what are her book titles? And so I think maybe she was mentioning some of the zines that you've been publishing and stuff, but yeah, just really any of your offerings and way to connect.
One that I wrote, this is probably most relevant. It's called Baking for Biodiversity. I also have a zine about seed saving, which was really my entry point into the green world. And I also have a couple of different goofy things about alternative economies and sharing economy. I can ship zines anywhere. Folks, I have like a little order form on my website. I don't know if you're able to enter that in the chat or something, or I can follow up. But also just reach out on Instagram. My professionalism level is low and pretty cobbled together and ad hoc. So send me a message or email or anything. Yeah, we're all just sticking stuff together this year, huh? My writing is on the internet somewhere at my website as well.
Great. No, and I'm sure we can make sure we have that contact info for you in the description when we get this video on YouTube for folks.
Yeah, great. And like I said, if you're Oregon-based or Portland-based and have questions about grain sourcing or want a cake or want to sign up for my Housemate's Bread subscription, like get in touch. We're here and always like to connect with folk about this stuff because we're big nerds.
And what is the website? name?
My personal website is something silly, which is my name .weebly.com, because I did not pay for to get the real URL. Starter bread is starterbread.com, and my Instagram is k.e.gourley.
Okay, well, great. No, thank you so much. And yeah, definitely getting some things in the chat too, just compliments on your artwork and just had the way that your books are laid out and stuff. So comments that they're beautiful. So really, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh yeah, no, I appreciate all of you joining here on a Wednesday. Thanks for your patience as I was a little nervous.
I think you did a great job, and yeah, we're really grateful. And yeah, especially now that the holidays are approaching and we're starting to get some cooler days, this idea of baking this cake sounds really attractive to me. We definitely have some birthdays coming up in the family and stuff, and it'll be fun to try something new. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I get fun. And also, just like final tip, you'll see that I have not put this in the oven, and there's like some misconception about cakes needing to go directly in an oven. I actually think that when you're working with 100% whole grain, like give it a little nap, like let it rest for a second, let it like hydrate, let it do its thing. Especially if you're using baking powder, like the leavening power is not like going to disappear. Baking powder is double acting. So, you know, you could get wild and rest this in the fridge overnight if you wanted to. Yeah, that's my last plug. Last tip.
And those are the type of tips you can't get when you just find a recipe online or whatever. So thank you for that. And yeah, for anyone else out there, you can learn more at coloradograinchain.com. The video should be posted soon. And just once again, thank you so much for joining us, Katie, and everyone. Take care of yourselves, be kind, and we'll see you next time.
Please vote.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. I'm gonna press the leave button now.
There you go. See ya.